candle cracked in the suffocating chamber. The incense could not hide the metallic stench, as if even the marble walls had been soaked with blood. Aurelia knew the door had just been locked, and with it, her youth was sealed away. Princess Aurelia stepped into her own wedding night, and the groom was her father, the aging king smiling on the throne. Scarlet drapery covered the hall. Gold glittered like a gilded mousetrap. To all eyes, it was glory. To Aurelia, every thread of white lace was strangling her, every sweet melody a funeral dirge. Since childhood, she had been raised as the pure jewel of the court, obedient, saintly, the soft weapon to secure the throne. But tonight, her father's gaze turned her into the final pawn in a game of incest, an empire without law, ruled only by desire wrapped in royal robes. The king raised his cup, fingers trembling, eyes cold as steel. Nobles around him bowed, their crooked smiles painted on their faces. No one dared ask, who would save Aurelia from this throne of shame? Aurelia knew with one wrong nod she would lose everything, her honor, her freedom, her very soul. But if she resisted, the entire court would grind her into ash. And this is when I must ask you, if you were Aurelia, would you swallow silence like poison, or scream before the court, bringing down blood and crown together? What Aurelia did not know was that this night's choice would turn her from a dutiful princess into a phantom of power, the only woman bold enough to tear the crown apart from within. The morning after, Aurelia woke beneath silk curtains heavy as chains. The air was thick with rose oil, too sweet, suffocating. She pressed her hand against her own chest, as if to be sure the heart still beat beneath the ivory cage of her ribs. The servants bowed lower than ever, eyes fixed on the floor. They dressed her like a doll, pinned pearls to her hair, fastened emeralds at her throat. Not one dared whisper what every breath in the palace already knew. She was no longer daughter, she was queen. But Aurelia felt the truth burning like acid. She was neither. Not daughter, not queen, only property. Every corridor echoed with the king's footsteps. That rhythm measured, relentless followed her into every chamber. She remembered when those steps meant safety. Now they were shackles, invisible but unbreakable. The fatal flaw was carved into her soul: obedience. Since birth she had been taught silence as survival, and silence had now led her into the perfect prison, a crown carved from her father's hunger. And I must ask you, if silence itself is the cage, would you break it? Or would you polish the bars and call it loyalty? At the banquet hall, Aurelia watched senators bow deeper than the marble pillars. Their eyes gleamed not with disgust, but calculation. They would not save her. They would profit from her humiliation. She smiled, lips painted red with crushed pomegranate. The smile was a lie, but it was her first weapon. What Aurelia could not yet see was that every lie she forced upon her lips would grow sharper until even kings would bleed. The throne room reeked of iron and roses. Aurelia stood beside the king, her hand locked in his like a shackle disguised as tenderness. Voices swelled beneath the marble arches, praises from courtiers, vows of loyalty from senators, hymns from priests. Every word was theater. Every bow was a blade disguised as reverence. She smiled, lips painted crimson, the same curve she had practiced for hours before polished bronze. That smile was armor. Yet beneath it, her pulse hammered like war drums. Silence was survival. But silence was killing her one breath at a time. Her gaze swept the hall. Senators hid their hunger behind lowered lids. Courtiers clapped as if their palms were not sweating. Priests pretended their hymns masked disgust. But Aurelia saw it all: calculation, fear, and the quiet thrill of scandal. To them she was not queen, not daughter, not even woman. She was evidence, proof that the king's will had devoured law itself. Aurelia remembered her mother's warning, "Obey, and you will live." The words returned like a ghost chained to her bones. But what kind of life was this? A jewel sealed inside a coffin of gold, a crown forged not of laurel, but of rust and hunger. The king squeezed her hand. His grip tightened until pain blossomed in her wrist. She did not flinch. Instead, she raised her chin higher, her gaze fixed not on his face as father, nor on his crown as king, but on the man who had become her enemy. For the first time, she allowed the thought to breathe. He must be defeated. And I must ask you, if obedience is survival, but survival is death, which would you choose? Would you polish the bars of the cage until they gleamed, or would you tear your hands bloody against them? The applause thundered. Aurelia curtsied, every movement graceful, every step rehearsed. Yet inside her, rebellion whispered with each breath. She wondered if anyone could see it, if anyone dared to guess that beneath the silk and jewels stood not a bride, but a blade sharpening itself in silence. She stole a glance at the senators. One met her eyes for a fraction of a heartbeat, then looked away. Fear or recognition? She could not tell, but in that fleeting moment, she realized she was not entirely alone. Whispers were already curling through the hall, whispers she could bend if she learned how. What Aurelia did not yet know was that the empire itself was cracking. And through those cracks, her shadow would seep, spreading like ink across marble until even kings drowned in it. The banquet stretched into endless night. Gold cups overflowed, roasted meats bled on silver platters, and laughter cracked like glass beneath the vaulted ceiling. Aurelia sat at the king's side, her face carved into serenity, though each cheer drilled deeper into her skull. Every toast was another nail sealing her into the coffin of loyalty. She raised her goblet, lips brushing wine that tasted of ash. Around her, nobles pretended to celebrate, but she saw their eyes flick from the king to herself, measuring, calculating. Some watched with pity, others with hunger. None dared to look long. To look was to betray knowledge, and in this court, knowledge was death. Aurelia's fatal flaw pressed against her ribs: obedience. She had been trained to smile, to nod, to remain silent. Yet silence tonight made her complicit in her own destruction. Her father leaned closer, his breath thick with wine. "Smile brighter," he whispered. "They must envy me." The words were command, not request. And I must ask you, if the cage demands you polish its bars, would you obey? Or would you let them rust until the whole prison collapses? She obeyed. Her smile widened, flawless, blinding. Gasps of admiration rippled down the table. But behind her teeth, her tongue pressed against the roof of her mouth, holding back words that could set the hall ablaze. She imagined shouting, imagined pointing at the king and naming his crime. For one terrifying moment, she almost did. The music swelled, drowning her hesitation. Dancers spun across marble, cloaks brushing against spilled wine. Aurelia's gaze locked on one senator again, the same man whose eyes had met hers in the throne room. He did not look away this time. Instead, his mouth twitched, the hint of a smile or perhaps a warning. Then he raised his cup toward her, too subtly for the king to notice. Something shifted inside Aurelia. Perhaps it was hope, or perhaps it was another trap. But she clung to it, a whisper that she was not entirely alone, that cracks in the empire could be pried wider with the right hands. The king slammed his goblet against the table, wine splattering like blood. "A toast!" he roared. "To Aurelia, jewel of my crown!" The hall echoed with hollow cheers. She lifted her cup again, hand steady though her pulse raged. Every eye in the chamber weighed her, wondering if she would break or bend. What no one knew, what even Aurelia did not yet grasp, was that tonight's smile would be remembered not as surrender, but as the mask beneath which rebellion first drew breath. The palace did not sleep. Even at midnight, torches hissed along the colonnades, casting restless shadows that danced like conspirators on the walls. Aurelia walked alone through corridors of marble, her silk gown whispering across cold stone. Every step echoed too loudly, as if the palace itself were listening. She paused before a bronze mirror. The reflection stared back at her, a queen in jewels, but a prisoner in truth. Her eyes were rimmed in gold, yet hollow. She lifted her hand, touched the crown pinned into her hair, and felt the weight press down like an executioner's blade. Aurelia thought of her mother again. "Obey, and you will live." The words coiled like snakes, but tonight she could no longer tell if she was alive or simply embalmed while still breathing. From the shadows, whispers slithered. Servants, guards, senators, the palace was alive with rumor. They all knew. They all pretended not to. And that silence, multiplied by hundreds of mouths, was more suffocating than chains. And I must ask you, when silence becomes universal, is it loyalty or is it fear wearing a crown? She stopped outside the Senate chamber. Doors of cedar stood shut, but voices leaked through the cracks, low, tense, hurried. Men debated behind closed doors, not prayers, not laws, but bargains. Aurelia pressed closer. Words drifted out. Succession, weakness, inheritance. Her name was spoken, soft and sharp. She froze, realizing that while she played the obedient bride, others already played her as pawn on their board. Her pulse quickened. She imagined stepping inside, exposing herself, demanding truth. But obedience held her tongue still. She turned away, clutching silence like a dagger she dared not unsheathe. Down another corridor, the senator whose eyes had lingered on hers waited in the shadows. He bowed, too quickly, as though afraid to be seen. "My queen," he whispered, voice thin as smoke. "The empire is cracking, and through cracks, water seeps." He dared no more, vanished before she could answer. His words lodged in her chest like embers refusing to die. Aurelia continued through the hall, each step heavier, each breath sharper. For the first time, she did not feel entirely caged. She felt watched, studied, perhaps even chosen. The thought terrified her more than solitude. At her chamber door, guards bowed. She entered alone, shutting the weight of the world behind carved cedar. Her hands trembled. She pressed them against the table until they stilled. Then she whispered to herself, barely audible, "If cracks exist, I will find them." What Aurelia did not yet see was that whispers of her name would soon rise above marble, twisting into shouts. And when the shouting began, no crown would be safe. The Senate gathered at dawn. Torches guttered in the chill air, smoke curling upward like unspoken confessions. Aurelia stood behind the king, her figure framed by marble columns, Her silence presented as loyalty, but inside, silence had become a battlefield. The senators bowed low, but the chamber reeked of hesitation. Words trembled in the air, questions of succession, cracks in the empire's armor. Aurelia watched them steal glances at her, then away, as if her very presence were a forbidden scripture. The king's voice thundered, promising eternity for his reign, dismissing whispers of weakness. His words were stone, heavy and absolute. Yet beneath them Aurelia heard the tremor of age, the cough he tried to bury in rhetoric. And she realized something dangerous. His crown was fragile, his body failing. The empire clung to a rotting pillar. Her fatal flaw, obedience, trembled inside her. Every instinct screamed, bow, remain still, survive. But survival no longer looked like life. It looked like death in slow motion. And I must ask you, if your silence becomes the rope that strangles you, would you keep holding it? Or would you finally let it slip from your hands? A senator rose. His voice was sharp as a blade. Long live the king, he declared, but then his gaze lingered on Aurelia. And may his heir ensure Rome's strength. The words cut through the chamber. All eyes shifted. The king's hand gripped Aurelia's shoulder, claiming her, binding her. She felt the bruise bloom beneath his fingers. Her choice hovered like a sword above her throat. Remain silent, accept the cage, and she would be remembered as nothing more than a victim. Or open her mouth, wield her voice, and step onto a path from which there was no return. The chamber waited. The silence thickened until it rang louder than any hymn. Aurelia's breath burned in her lungs. She could not hide behind obedience any longer. Not here. Not now. She lifted her chin, the faintest movement, yet it silenced even the king's cough. Her voice, when it came, was low but steady. Rome deserves strength that does not rot with age. The words fell like stones into still water. The ripples spread instantly, gasps, murmurs, a single laugh quickly stifled. The king froze. His grip on her shoulder slackened. He turned his gaze upon her, eyes narrowing, weighing daughter against traitor. What Aurelia did not yet know was that this single sentence had set her path in stone. From this moment, she could never return to silence. The empire itself would force her to choose, seize power or be crushed beneath it. The chamber did not breathe. Aurelia's words still lingered in the air, a spark thrown into dry straw. Every senator's face turned pale or flushed, their eyes darting between father and daughter, between king and queen, between ruler and threat. The king rose slowly from his throne, his robes dragging like the wings of a vulture. He fixed Aurelia with a gaze colder than marble. "Repeat yourself," he demanded, voice heavy as a sword drawn from its sheath, "so all may hear your loyalty." Her body trembled. Obedience clawed at her throat, urging silence, urging retreat. Yet retreat was gone. The moment she had spoken, silence was no longer a shield. It was a grave. Aurelia lifted her chin higher, her pulse a storm. "Rome deserves strength," she said again, louder this time. Strength untouched by decay. The senators gasped as if she had struck the king. Murmurs erupted, too loud to contain. Some faces lit with secret satisfaction. Others twisted in horror. All of them knew a line had been crossed. Daughter had spoken against father. Queen had spoken against king. There was no return. And I must ask you, if a single truth could unmake your cage but paint a target on your heart, would you speak it? Or would you swallow it until it rotted you from the inside? The king's hand clenched the throne's armrest until his knuckles whitened. He forced a smile, brittle as cracked stone. "My daughter," he said, voice strained, "is young." She mistakes concern for defiance. Laughter rose among courtiers, hollow and forced, desperate to mend the fracture. But Aurelia saw the fury blazing beneath his facade. Tonight he would not forget. Tonight punishment would follow. The chamber descended into chaos, some senators whispering alliances, others eyeing Aurelia with new calculation. She had become more than ornament, more than property. She had become possibility. Dangerous, unstable, intoxicating possibility. Aurelia felt the shift, a current pulling her forward. She could not stop it now, even if she wanted to. The moment demanded it. The empire demanded it. For the first time, she was no longer simply enduring. She was shaping. As the session ended, Aurelia walked beside the king, every step echoing like a drum of war. He did not touch her hand. He did not look at her. The silence between them was thicker than blood. What Aurelia did not yet see was that her words had already split the court in two. From now on, every smile offered to her would be edged with knives, and every ally she found would demand a price soaked in blood. Night fell heavy on the palace, but no one slept. Rumors stalked the corridors faster than guards on patrol. Aurelia's words had spread like wildfire, whispered by servants, repeated by priests, dissected by senators. For the first time, her name was spoken not as ornament, not as daughter, but as defiance. The king summoned her, alone. She entered the private chamber where maps of the empire sprawled across a vast table. Candles burned low, shadows quivering like conspirators on the walls. The king did not sit. He stood rigid, his hands gripping the edge of the table until veins bulged. His crown rested beside him, gleaming but abandoned. "You shamed me," he said, his voice raw iron. "Before Rome, before gods." Aurelia bowed her head, the instinct of obedience twitching like an old scar. Yet she did not kneel. She kept her spine straight, her eyes steady. "I spoke truth," she answered, "and truth does not shame Rome. It strengthens it." His hand shot out, striking the table so hard the maps quivered. "Truth?" he spat. "You are my daughter. Your truth is mine to command. And I must ask you, if your blood demands loyalty but your soul demands rebellion, which would you betray?" The silence between them stretched, taut as a drawn bow. He stepped closer, his shadow swallowing hers. "You think senators will save you? They will use you, break you, as I made you." His voice dropped lower. "And when they are finished, I will still be king." Aurelia's pulse thundered, but she did not flinch. She thought of the eyes in the Senate, the fleeting glance of the senator who had dared acknowledge her. She thought of whispers curling through marble halls. She thought of her own smile, sharpened into a weapon. "Perhaps," she said quietly, "or perhaps they will find strength in me that you have lost." The words shocked even her. They tasted of fire, of steel drawn from scabbard. The king's face contorted, rage, disbelief, and a flicker of fear he could not fully hide. His hand twitched toward the crown on the table, as if it might shield him. But Aurelia's gaze followed, and in that moment the crown looked smaller, emptier than she had ever seen it. What Aurelia did not yet know was that tonight marked the first time her father saw her not as daughter, not as queen, but as rival. And rivals in Rome were never allowed to live long. The great hall of judgment roared with voices. Senators shouted over one another. Priests raised trembling hands. Guards lined the marble aisles with swords unsheathed. At the center, Aurelia stood beneath torchlight, her shadow stretching long, her silence heavier than iron. All eyes burned into her, waiting for the next fracture. The king entered, crown gleaming, robes dragging like chains of authority. His face was carved from fury. "Rome," he thundered, "has been poisoned by whispers, and the venom is my own blood." His gaze fell upon Aurelia. She is not loyal. She is corrupted. She is enemy. Gasps erupted. The hall swayed with tension. Aurelia's throat tightened, her fatal flaw clawing at her obedience, silence, survival. All she had ever known was to bow. If she bowed now, perhaps she would live. Perhaps the hall would calm. Perhaps the crown would remain distant from her head. But bowing meant erasing herself forever. And I must ask you, if the choice is life without self, or death with defiance, which would you take? The king lifted a scroll, unrolling it with shaking hands. "Proof," he announced. "Aurelia has conspired with senators, plotted treason against her father, against her king. The law demands judgment." He flung the scroll open, yet its surface was blank. No words, no seal, no proof, only parchment. A lie naked in the torchlight. The chamber erupted shouts of disbelief, cries of outrage, laughter from corners too bold to hide. Senators surged, some defending her, others condemning. But the truth was bare. The king had no evidence, only fear. Aurelia's pulse steadied. She stepped forward, her voice slicing through the chaos. "Rome deserves strength," she said, the same words as before, but now louder, unbroken, undeniable. "If proof exists, show it. If not, know this. Silence will not chain me again." The hall shook with noise. Some cheered, others cursed. But the balance had shifted. She was no longer ornament, no longer pawn. She had exposed the king's weakness before the empire. The king staggered, his cough tearing through his words, his crown tilted, sliding on sweat-damp hair. For the first time he looked fragile, mortal. His eyes locked on Aurelia with a hatred so pure it promised blood. Yet behind that hatred flickered terror, the terror of a throne slipping away. What Aurelia did not yet know was that by breaking silence, she had shattered the last bond of obedience. From this moment, Rome would not rest until one truth was decided. Would she seize the crown or be buried beneath it? Dawn bled across Rome, painting the sky in bruised crimson. The great hall lay silent now, emptied of senators and priests, but its marble still echoed with last night's uproar. Aurelia stood alone at the center, her footsteps faint against the cold floor. She had spoken. She had shattered silence. And now, nothing could be undone. The king's throne loomed above her, vacant. He had been carried away, coughing, weakened, eyes burning with hatred that could not hide his fear. For the first time in her life, Aurelia had seen him not as father, not as king, but as a man. A man crumbling beneath the weight of his own crown. Servants whispered in corners. Guards shifted uneasily, their loyalties splintered. Senators would meet in secret before sunset, already scheming to shape the empire's future. And Aurelia's name, her name, was on every tongue. Some called her traitor, others savior. She had become the crack in the empire's marble, the fracture no hand could mend. Her fatal flaw, obedience, lay in ruins. She had broken it herself, torn it from her bones, and in doing so she had severed every chain that bound her. Yet freedom was not triumph. It was danger sharpened to a point. Every ally would demand her, every enemy would hunt her. The crown hovered, neither hers nor her father's, but ready to crush whoever faltered first. And I must ask you, if power opens before you like a blade, do you grasp it knowing it will cut? Or do you turn away, leaving it for another to wield against you? Aurelia raised her gaze to the throne. For a heartbeat she imagined herself seated there, robes on her shoulders, scepter in hand, senators bowing. The image glimmered, intoxicating, terrifying. Then it faded. She was not yet queen. She was something rarer, more dangerous. Possibility. Outside, the city stirred. Merchants opened their stalls, soldiers drilled in the squares, children chased each other through alleys. Life continued, indifferent to crowns. Yet Aurelia knew. Rome itself was shifting beneath their feet. The empire had entered a new story, and she was its voice. She pressed her fingers to the cold marble of the throne's armrest. "If Rome demands blood for strength," she whispered, "then Rome will bleed." Her words dissolved into the chamber, into history. What Aurelia now knew was the truth her mother's warning never spoke. Obedience buys survival, but defiance writes destiny. And from this dawn forward, Aurelia's destiny would echo louder than silence, until marble itself remembered her name.